Today's last speaker needs no introduction. I'm sure many of you have run across Jodie in your lives in one way or another, but Jodie has deserved that attention in that she has stepped up to the plate with her husband Mark Emery and is leading the charge in this country and around the world. She was down in California a year and a half ago. I actually sent Gail down there trying to help pass Prop 19 and is doing everything she can aside from trying to look after her husband and Mark, running the store and the vapor lounge and just really being a leader in this movement. And is a great joy to work with and a great joy to know. And I'm so very happy to have her here. It's her first full talk at a convention, but it certainly will not be her last. Thanks so much for coming, Jodie.
It's not pouring rain out, so that's good.
Thanks, Jodie.
Always take pleasure in the small good things, like it's not pouring.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, I have spoken on UBC sometime.
Well, you kind of dropped in, but I don't think I had you like on the schedule.
I was just there with him. That's right. Mark's sidekick. That's what I was for years and still am. We're still partners, of course, and everything. And well, I'm Jodie Emery, and maybe a quick show of hands, who doesn't know who Mark Emery is? Okay, good. It's easy then. Well, I'll just, of course, give a quick overview. Mark sold seeds for a decade, using the money to finance marijuana activism from political parties in BC and in the US and around the world, even in Israel and New Zealand. He helped finance conferences and rallies and state ballot initiatives. So Colorado and DC and Nevada, they have legal medical marijuana in part because Mark gave them money to help put that on the ballot. And he has not only done a lot of great work himself, but what he's most proud of course, is inspiring others to do great work themselves. He didn't want to be one leader with many followers. He didn't want to need to consult with anyone about what he wanted to do. He just had a dream and had people who had dreams as well. He wanted to help them do that. And so there are many people, even in this room and in the community, who have worked with Mark or been inspired by him or had some sort of connection, but they really took that and did their own thing. We need a lot more of that. And that's something I'm going to talk about. Everybody knows about Mark for the most part. I want to talk about the human toll of the war on drugs, which is, of course, people losing their freedom, losing their lives, losing the ability to be with their families and loved ones. But I'm also going to talk about the state of Canada and where we're going now compared to the US, and there are a lot of examples we can use. So let's rewind to 2005. We had the Toker's Bowl. We had, Harper wasn't in power yet. There was kind of a bit of a change in Canada. We had decriminalization being proposed. The U.S., of course, said not on our watch. And I've just been to a U.S. state where it is decriminalized, and they don't check your ID. They just give you a ticket under Daffy Duck or whatever name you give. So Canada had been making progress in that sense. Everyone looked at Canada as being really cool, really free. Is marijuana legal or not? Nobody really knew. Of course, it wasn't legal, but it was tolerated. And things started to change around then. On July 29th, 2005, I think it's fair to say all of Canada was shocked when the headline said that Mark Emery, Michelle Rainey, and Greg Williams were facing extradition to the United States and facing life in prison for those seed sales. It made Canadians outraged, not only because it was ridiculous that it was seeds, it wasn't weed, it wasn't drugs, these aren't drug dealers, these are political activists, everybody knew. They were outraged that it was the DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, operating on Canadian soil. And even though Cannabis Culture Magazine and Plot TV and Mark and others had been telling Canadians, there's a DEA office down the street, right on Hastings. We have DEA offices in Canada because their mandate is to work around the world to suppress legalization, and they straight up say that. So Canadians were insulted first that Mark Emery, well-known activist, was facing life in U.S. prison when he never left the country, paid his taxes, ran legitimate, open, transparent campaigns, was very accessible, and that we had the U.S. operating on Canadian soil and not just operating on our soil and working with law enforcement here, but taking Canadian citizens and saying, we're going to bring you to our country you've never been to and make you face life in prison, 30 years minimum, up to life in prison for your activism. That was a big shocker across Canada. Everyone was up in arms about our sovereignty, and indeed there have been a lot of chips being chipped away at our sovereignty with the US and Canada. And this is 2005, remember, so it was quite a shocker. And we said at the time, this is just a sign of things to come. We knew that things were getting scary. You know, George Bush in power down there, the war on drugs was being stepped up. We still had quite a bit of struggle, but that seemed to me like the turning point where after that happened, we had Harper win his first minority in 2006 it was. You know, we had some scary days showing up in Canada, but in the US there was a bit of sparkling of change. We have California, where they have the population of Canada in one state. They have obviously had medical marijuana since 1994, it was? 96? They've had medical marijuana for a long time, and a number of US states were putting forward ballot initiatives themselves. And again, a lot of that was done through people who were inspired by Mark or received money from Mark. Normal had different state organizations who received money, and people who just said, I want to make a difference and get involved. Now the US, they have their states' rights, and we don't really have the equivalent here in Canada. We don't really have provincial rights. We can't tell the government to F off and let us do our own thing. Not so much like the US does. So there's a bit of a struggle there, because when we look to the US now, and ever since 2005, we've seen a lot of progress being made on the state level, and of course federally with Obama getting elected, everyone was excited. There was hope for change. You know, he had admitted to smoking pot. Oh, hope, 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 hope. Always something dangled in front of you instead of reality, right? You could dream of this and vote for me with this dream, but it's not going to happen. We've seen it not happen. But I still look to the U.S. as an example of positive change. Granted, like I said, the drug war is increasing in many ways down there federally, but on the state level, you're having so much change that it's going to have an impact federally at one point or another. Because, like I said, I was in a state, Massachusetts, where they actually have decriminalization, and there aren't federal agents on the street going and looking for pot smokers to bust. So when a state police officer or a city police officer in Boston or any police in that state come across someone smoking a joint, they just say, okay, it's a $150 ticket, give me a name. Any name, they don't check your ID, they just need a name. Here you go, here's a ticket. Just don't do that, you know. So people there are pulling up buds in restaurants in the United States on the East Coast, and I tell them, I can't believe I'm a Canadian being blown away by East Coast US. Like, and they didn't have much fear because they had been organizing for so long to make this happen. In a number of other US states, we have medical marijuana decriminalization and even legalization happening on the state level. The reason that's happening is because state politicians have the backing of the people. We know that public opinion and all the research and all the statistics and all the history shows prohibition is a failure, and now it's becoming politically positive to say that you support that. You know, politicians aren't going to be so scared to say they support any prohibition when they can point to former presidents of many countries around the world, and they can point to 4 mayors in Vancouver and 4 former attorneys general. I mean, we have more and more people coming out so that other politicians and other not pro-pot people but anti-prohibition people, they're willing to join our ranks because it's not as scary or as threatening to their career to say something. And that's where the U.S. is making a difference, is they've got these lawmakers, even on the city level. I mean, John McKay, Mark's former prosecutor, district attorney for Washington District of Western District of Washington, he's supporting legalization now. He's endorsing it. He's testifying in favor for it. I testified alongside him for legalization in Washington State. And you know, we have people who are willing to change sides. They're willing to come over to our side. And some people might be a little, you know, questioning of that. Like, how can we trust them? You know, they used to put people in prison. How can we dare trust them? And to that, I would say, look at LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a very valuable organization of people who have been on the front lines, and look to these other people who are not pro-pot. They're not endorsing pot use, they're not endorsing hemp, they're not even endorsing medical marijuana. They're just saying the war on drugs is an expensive, insane failure that is not sustainable and we can't continue. And that's what we're going to be seeing more and more of, is this argument that it's not sustainable. In the US particularly, they have been repealing their mandatory minimums in some cases. They're trying to find ways, even in Texas, of how to get people out of the prison system and get them treatment or get them some sort of other punishment that isn't as harsh as incarceration. And I'll agree that there should be no punishment for marijuana, but if there's going to be something offered that's less than a harsher punishment, I think it's fair to go for that. Needless to say, I'm going to see my husband in 2014 because of the plea deal he received for 5 years instead of 30 to life. So I'm really an advocate of, if you are facing punishment and they offer you something less, take something less. I do believe in fighting for what you believe in, but as we all know, the court system, it's kind of all rigged. You know, it's not an easy win if you want to go to trial. They can suck you dry financially and wear you down. So take the least punishment possible is my goal, and that's what the U.S. states are doing. They're saying we don't really want to spend all this money putting nonviolent people in prison, so we're going to look at different models. And we've seen in recent months with Canada and Bill C-10, which very unfortunately passed the Senate, and is going back to the House of Commons, we've seen a lot of discussion here in Canada about the failure of the drug war in the U.S. and the U.S. example of what not to do in terms of increasing the drug war and what we should do in terms of changing our policies and changing the punishment available. So when I mentioned mandatory minimums in the U.S., we haven't had that in Canada yet for drug crimes, and of course it is coming into place with this new legislation. But mandatory minimums have been one of the worst aspects of the war on drugs, because it's one thing to arrest somebody and have them taken away from their family and their kids and their parents and their job, and lose their right to go abroad and lose their right to get jobs and lose the right to even have your home or your kids. People lose a lot when they're facing the consequences of the war on drugs and the drug laws. And mandatory minimums have devastated the United States. 1 in 100 Americans are behind bars or under the police state or law enforcement watch because in a huge part of the war on drugs, especially minorities who are taken out of their communities and devastated, continuing a racial war, which is something I like to call Obama out on, that you know, he is continuing and increasing the most racist policies that exist today, which is the war on drugs and the mass incarceration of people. And mandatory minimums are a huge, huge part of that. Almost nobody goes to trial. Nobody can afford it. Nobody can win against laws like conspiracy. And that's what Mark was facing, and Michelle and Greg. Conspiracy charges. That means they knew that other people were growing pot. How many of you know somebody who's dealing or growing pot? You don't have to say who, but obviously you all know somebody is breaking the law. Hell, the Canadian Revenue Agency was guilty in that conspiracy charge too, because they knew what was going on. The government knew. Every single person in Canada who read that Mark Emery was selling seeds was guilty of conspiracy, because they knew what was going on and they didn't stop it. So you've got laws like conspiracy laws that get put against people like Mark, Greg, and Michelle, where they're facing 10 years minimum on each charge, 30 years minimum, 2 life in prison. That's mandatory minimums for you, and that's what we're going to get in Canada, and that's what's led to a massive increase in the prison population in the U.S. Now with the budget costs, it costs a lot of money to keep people in prison, a lot of money, over 100 grand you're looking at per prisoner. I think it's only 8,000 or something they spend per student in the country here in Canada, so that's a huge disparity that needs to be changed. And unfortunately in the U.S., the solution to the cost, private for-profit prisons. You get these companies like Geo Group International who promise to give you a full package. They'll provide the buses and the airplanes that move prisoners around, or the stock, I like to call them. The prisoners are stock. The more you have in your warehouse, the more money you get, because they offer to move around the stock. They offer to build the warehouses, the prisons. They build these prisons. They offer to run the staff and run everything from the laundry to the food services. Geo Group is your one-stop shop for mass incarceration, for a profit on the stock market. And that's what's happened in the U.S. is you've got an enormous industry. The fastest growing industry is the private prison industry. There are other prison groups like the Corrections Corporation of America, and these companies go around, and not only do they offer themselves as a cheaper alternative for incarceration, they also spend millions and millions of dollars lobbying against Prop 19 for legalization, lobbying against any decriminalization. They actually report in their shareholder information we're making sure that our prisons remain at least 98% capacity and never go any further. And we promise to keep fighting for tougher immigration laws, tougher drug laws, to make sure that you keep making money on our stock. And that's, I think they're at maybe $1 something per share right now. If you want to go look it up, if you go to Forbes.com or anywhere, you can find Geo Group, for-profit private prison company. And we've known about this in the U.S. for a long time. That's where the example has grown a lot. And Geo Group in particular operates around the world. They brag about having facilities all over the world. They're such a huge, huge company. And here we've been worried a long time. I think we've been talking about the concern of private prisons for years in Canada. We knew that's what Harper was going to go into. Like, who didn't see that one coming? And sure enough, Geo Group has been having meetings with the Public-Private Partnership of Canada, with the Conservative government, to discuss having Canadian prisons under their control. And how did we find this out? Through a blog, and also the Forbes website, where the Geo Group information says Geo Group operates in the US, Australia, blah, 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 and Canada. And for me to see that, somebody posted this on my Facebook page, and I was like, when did Harper make that announcement? You know, when did those guys actually get the contracts? Are the contracts signed? Where are they running? And what scares me is that with the Bill C-10, we've had a lot of discussion in the media and with the politicians of every province saying, I don't want to pay that bill, that's too expensive, you're making it cost too much. And a lot of them are saying that not in a way of saying the drug war is unaffordable and inhumane and it's wrong to put people in prison to generate jobs for the economy. They're not arguing on that point. They're arguing on the point, oh, well, we can't afford it, so come on, federal government, give us a couple more dollars. Can you give us a couple more millions so we can run these prisons? And the federal government is saying, no, you don't get anything. You don't really get much more from us than what you get. So what we will offer you is a cheaper alternative, private prisons. Meet our buddies from Geo Group, you know, and that's what's happening right now. I've asked Libby Davies to look into it. She said she has found records of meetings between Geo Group and the Conservative government where they're working on bringing these private for-profit prison companies to Canada. And what's really scary is that's how they're going to sell it. When we have the opposition that I was so excited about with our attorneys generals and all those saying we can't afford the crime bill, the unfortunate thing is you're going to get people like Christy Clark, and I was going to say some nasty names in there too, but Christy Clark, who's just sitting on Harper's lap doing whatever he wants her to do, you know, yap, yap, yap. She is going to say, guess what, British Columbians, we have a great option for making it affordable to build these prisons. We've got Geo Group here who's willing to do it for less. Now, the big scandal there is, well, there's a lot wrong with that, but a major issue is that private prisons don't actually cost any less. They cost more to run in the long term, and they run the worst sort of prisons you can get. Mark, when he was first extradited to Seattle, he waited there at SeaTac for his sentencing. So he was there for a few months, and that was Supermax. They put everybody in Supermax before trial or before sentencing because they don't know what you're guilty of. You could be a madman, so they lock you up. And in that case, they even covered up the windows. So this thin slit of window that they had in their cell, you couldn't even see out. It was all fogged up like a bathroom privacy screen. So they were deprived of any outdoor light or any time outside. And then we were told that he was going to be moved to Taft, which is a prison down in California. But I got a phone call from Mark, found out he was being sent to Georgia, a prison in Georgia called Folkston, a little town called Folkston. And this prison was a brand new prison, which meant when I went to look it up, there was no information on it online because Geo Group had just bought the location from the state. It used to be a state prison where there were actually riots and murders and all sorts of horrific things went on. So the state was like, well, let's shut that down and take a couple million from Geo Group, who promised to run it as a proper federal prison. So when Mark showed up there, the place was run down, it was shoddy, and the people who had been hired knew nothing. They were, I don't want to say they were idiots in a rude way, but they hadn't even been trained properly. They were thrown into the situation of being a brand new federal prison, private, for-profit federal prison, where most of the inmates weren't even American. They were immigrants. They were illegal immigrants. They had been caught with a bit of pot, and they weren't actually from the U.S., even though they had been raised their whole life there. So that's something that's booming really big in the U.S. too, and we're seeing in Canada a real attack on, you know, immigration and trying to keep people out and punishing those who do come here, trying to flee their countries. In the U.S., there's big business in locking up nonviolent drug offenders. and illegal immigrants. And Mark was in this prison. There were no computers or any way to really communicate besides an old typewriter. So Mark typed up blogs from the prison describing how there had been a medical emergency and the medical emergency button on the wall didn't work and somebody was nearly killed. He almost died because the staff said, oh, well, you know, we just thought he was faking it. And there were all sorts of things, like they took away National Geographic magazines and said that they were, you know, explicit because there might be some boobies in there once in a while. It's like they did insane things, but even horrible things, like a guy who lost his dentures and the prison is supposed to replace that. They kept refusing to, and Mark kept blogging about all these terrible things that went on. And he tried to remedy them, and a lot of them did get fixed. There was a guy who wanted to get married, and they said, you're not allowed to get married in here. And he said, yes, I am. And Mark went and found the legal work and was kind of the in-house lawyer, and he helped remedy these situations. He got that to be changed. But he also got word that Geo Group headquarters and the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons, the federal agency that operates all the prisons, including helping the private ones manage them, they were all reading his blogs and they weren't happy about it, and they rejected his prison transfer request to come to Canada, and in it they said something like, he knows why he's in trouble and not getting it. They kind of said, yeah, he needs to learn how to shut up, and then we'll let him go. And we were really worried then when they were shipping him out, because it was like, oh my gosh, are they going to send him somewhere even worse? And he calls me on 4/20 last year, on April 20th, saying, I'm here at my new prison. I'm in Mississippi, Yazoo City, Mississippi, medium security prison. Now, at first we were pretty concerned about that, because you think, oh, medium security, that's obviously tougher guys. Those are more serious crimes. And sure enough, there are people there who murdered others, or a lot of bank robbers apparently in the U.S. Who knew? There were like a lot of bank robbers. But Mark was put in there, and to our relief, this prison, which is run by the federal government, which is not a private prison, it's a proper, you know, as proper as prisons can get. It is a proper federal facility where he does have his own cell, which he didn't before. In the private prisons, they put them in a room like this. Imagine a room like this with triple bunk beds. That's where you live, full of like 60 to 70 to 80 other people in one big dormitory. And that's how disease gets spread a lot too. And we're going to see more of that in Canadian prisons. Mark contracted MRSA, the superbug that's resistant to antibiotics, by being in these close quarters, which are leading towards a lot of sickness and ailments and diseases going around inside prisons. But Mark was exposed to that in the private prisons, so that's, you know, another example of how terrible they can be, that it is a life-threatening condition. It can be, and that's where he suffered. But now he's in a proper prison where they've basically given him everything he complained about lacking before, that they made him so he doesn't really have anything to complain about. And I think the government is learning that with Mark Emery. You just have to stop giving him something to bitch about. That's the only way to shut him up. You know, you can't punish him into silence. You just gotta kind of give him less to complain about. And of course we want him to be transferred home. He can apply for transfer again next year, and that takes about a year to get through. So at this point, his early release date is July 9th, 2014. That's 85% of the 5-year sentence. And when prisoners are on good behavior and they don't do anything wrong, they get that 85% early release date. So that's what we're looking forward to. Of course, the U.S. federal government rejected his initial transfer request, but we believe the next time around they'll accept it because they want to get rid of people in their prison system. It is too expensive. And so they're going to send him home probably, but the Canadian government will have it in their hands. So we'll have this government forced probably to say no. They probably have a lot of crude things they'd like to say about him. Harper's own assistant at one time joked about, I hope Mark Emery enjoys the prison showers. And I made a big fuss about that, and he got canned pretty quick. But he's in charge of Sun News now, so Harper and his cronies are all still together. But you've got a mentality in this country right now where they believe that people in prison should really suffer. And it's hard to advocate for prisons, for prisoners' rights. It really is. I think if you're trying to defend any group of people who are mistreated, it's most difficult to try and advocate for the prisoners, because most people tend to think that they're bad people, they're meant to be in prison. And in the U.S., that sort of attitude has led to not a lot of effort to change their policies on that front, on the human rights front. And in Canada, we're going to have the same struggle, because obviously Harper feels he can do anything he wants. He's kind of got a clear path ahead of him. There's not really a strong opposition leader. I think, how many people here are optimistic about Canada's future? Hands up. Yay, okay. A little, right? A little. There's still reason to have hope, right? And what I'm getting at is, for the longest time, we looked to the U.S. as a major example of the failure of the drug war and something that the rest of the world should never emulate, especially Canada. And now, switch it around, Mark's been down in the U.S. since 2010, and there's been a lot of progress happening down there, but up here, we've been having quite a few setbacks. And what I like to say when I speak to Americans, as I did at the Liberty Forum, I tell them that they need to continue their work not only for themselves, but because the rest of the world depends on it. The war on drugs started in the U.S. really, and it emanates from there. You know, the DEA, a lot of the war on drugs, private prisons, a lot of these horrible policies are created in the U.S. and forced upon other countries, often through the UN. Everybody signs on to the UN Single Convention, whatever it's called. But then you have countries like Canada saying, oh, we can't do anything because we signed this agreement. Well, in the U.S., you have people saying, no, we're going to take it to the local level. We're going to take it to the state level, and we're going to push federally to make a difference. And we need the U.S. to do it first. Mark didn't like when I said that once. I said it in an interview that Canada can't really legalize until the U.S. does. And he said, you shouldn't say that. Don't tell Canadians to give up hope until America fixes it, because how likely is that? But I think it's true that we have the U.S. as an example of, look how wrong it went, look at their disaster, look at the expense, look at the way the war on drugs is destroying communities. And let me just go off on a side tangent. I forgot to mention this, but the worst thing, one of the worst things about private prisons that we're going to see in Canada is that they make people work. You have to take a job in the prison. And usually on massive prison complex grounds, there is a factory run by Unicor mostly. Unicor does uniforms, military outfits, gun straps, helmets. Most of the military gear used by the U.S. around the world to kill poor people who have done nothing wrong is built kind of at the back of a gun by prisoners in the U.S. So what the U.S. has created is a massive for-profit private prison industry that not only enslaves these people and forces them to work for pennies or just a few bucks an hour. Mark gets $18 a month for his full-time job. Wow. They're making them work on creating goods, items, products that are actually destroying other lives abroad. And like I said, it's really hard to advocate for prisoners' rights and say it's wrong to make them work, because a lot of people think, oh, prisoners should be allowed or able to work. The fact that they can earn an income is better than not having that ability and not having a job. And quite frankly, Mark appreciates having his recreation room. He takes care of the guitars and stuff in the music room. He appreciates having that because it keeps him busy. You know, having a job of any kind keeps your days going. So it's true that prisoners should have the ability to work if they want, but to force them to work and at these cut rate wages not only is wrong on that level, but when you look out into the Canadian community or the U.S. where you have people who desperately need jobs, they will do anything. They will do construction work. They'll make anything. They'll make uniforms. They'll sew it. But they can't compete. How can they compete against people who are locked up making the same stuff for $1 an hour when they need that job, getting at least like 10, 20, they need that job. And it's not being offered to the general public at large. It's being given to these private prison companies who say, hey, we've got a workforce and we have more African Americans behind bars today than we did during slavery. So you want to make use of them? Real cheap, real easy. We've got everything in place. And that's one of the most sickening things about these prisons. And we know that in Canada there's going to be more of that, because we had prison farms for a long time, and those are proper jobs for prisoners to have. They get outside, they deal with animals, they deal with plants, they learn skills they can take out to the real world, they learn compassion for other living creatures. We know that prison farms have been rehabilitative and restorative type justice measures for a long time. And Harper government paved them all over, literally. Took AAA grade farmland, paved it over, and what are they going to build there? Massive prisons, probably run by Geogroup, and massive factories to support our growing military in Canada. And that's really scary. And what we have is the U.S. as an example of what went wrong, but we also are able to look to them as an example of what we can do right. And in that sense, we do have many different states who have organized either on a national scale with organizations like NORML, or on a small scale, like they make their own Safer Colorado or different groups, And you're seeing a lot of action take place down there because it got so bad and they're at such a tipping point where they really can't afford it. And they realize it's not only unaffordable in the sense of spending the cops budget and the court budget. 70% of our court time in BC is actually spent on drug cases, by the way. 70%. And we've got a court crisis right now. And prohibition. You'll get a 70% reduction in the budget, but nobody's going to listen to that. But you have these costs of prohibition that we will get rid of, but you also have whole new jobs and opportunities that you're going to create. And California is an example of that. I mean, we see they're kind of like the wild, wild west, and there's some questions about how legitimate their medical doctors are with the mini skirt girls. Come see Dr. Kush, you know, like that's, I don't know how medically legitimate that is, but at least people are getting access, and at least they're not facing as much punishment, and that again is always a positive thing. But you're seeing people who are organizing on these levels from the small political field up. Because once you start getting every city councillor and mayors saying, hey, listen, our constituents, they really, really want this, and it's really getting on our nerves because they're not shutting up about it. And you're going to have premiers and people saying, well, like, you know, that guy said he supports legalization. Let's go visit Jean Dosage and see like what his talking points are, because obviously public opinion is going this way, and with public opinion must go politicians because they need votes. And so even though cannabis is seen as a, shrug that off issue, like Christy Clark saying, I don't know about prohibition, that's a federal issue. And it's like, come on, Christy, you said prohibition's a failure on your radio show before. Don't cop out now. Yeah. But when you get enough pressure building and building and building, they're going to have to give. They're going to have to say, you know what, it's true, I agree, we have to make a difference. And I'm not afraid to say it because I have law enforcement and judges and politicians and attorneys generals and presidents of former countries. They have a big base of growing support. And right now in our community in Canada and the US, I feel we have two different groups working towards the same goal, but kind of at a different angle. You've got the pro-pot people, and I'd consider like Ted and Chris and a lot of us here are pro-pot. We love pot. We think medical marijuana is saving lives. We know medical marijuana is saving lives. We know that hemp can make a huge difference. We know that cannabis is the tree of life put on this earth for the healing of the nations. I believe that. I believe cannabis has a huge role in our history of mankind, and I want to fight for that. But in order to do that, we need to bring on board people who are not pro-pot. And that's the argument against prohibition. We need the anti-prohibitionists on our side. So when you've got groups like Stop the Violence BC, that's Dr. Evan Wood, and you've got him working with these former mayors in Vancouver, and you've got the former attorneys generals, and you've got experts and academics who don't even use cannabis, but they're willing to stand up and say, prohibition is a failure, we need to do something different. And backing them up is us saying, damn right, we've been saying that for decades, thanks for joining the bandwagon. But you know, we back you and take our message, keep pushing it. Because I said this in an article recently, we aren't going to legalize cannabis, remove it from the schedule by having a 420 rally every year. We aren't. It's a wonderful celebration of our culture. It's a great opportunity to get a lot of people together and to show regular businessmen on their lunch hour that you can have a farmer's market of weed and it's not going to be total anarchy and destruction. You know, it's a beautiful example of the type of people that we are, where we can say, do you think these 10,000 people should be in prison? Do you agree with Harper that these 10,000 kids should lose all their opportunities for life? And so when you have the numbers and our pot movement, we are a base that we can point to as in we are harmless people who are trying to help others and making a difference in a positive way, but we are working alongside these politicians who will never speak at a 420 rally, but they will carry our message to the halls of power where it needs to be taken. So we need to make sure that we don't cut off any opportunity to work with people who can push our cause forward, because the discussion now isn't whether we should legalize pot or not. I think really the discussion that's been decided. The majority of Canadians agree that marijuana should be legal. A majority of people around the world understand this is old news and we're dragging our feet and it's about time we did something. But, you know, where are we going to go? Where are we going to go from here? The discussion now is what's beyond prohibition. What are we going to have, a free-for-all? where cannabis is just removed from the schedule and people can grow it in their backyards like tomatoes or buy it at the grocery store like tomatoes? Or are we going to have like a coffee shop model like Amsterdam, or a coffee shop like Starbucks model? Are we going to have a wine model? Are we going to have a medical restriction model? Is the government going to be in charge of distribution? So all these questions are coming up now, and that's what we're up against. The prohibitionists don't have a leg to stand on. You'll notice that there's never people saying, oh man, I was for legalization and I was all wrong, man. Prohibition's the only way to go. That's the way that'll fix it all. Look at all this evidence why prohibition is a great model. That's not happening anymore. We're past that battle. We're past the point of explaining that marijuana shouldn't be illegal anymore, because quite frankly, most people agree with us. And we're lucky to be in Canada where that is the situation. In the UK, you've got activists. I spoke to Cambridge University students for sensible drug policy, and they said, well, like, we can't even go talk to people on the street. People don't support marijuana here. It's not like Canada or the US where you've got, you know, most people would say it's not that big a deal, blah, blah, blah. In the UK and a lot of places around the world, they still need public opinion on their side. And what they need is the US and Canada and other examples to point to. So I say, you know, we've got the US as an example of what went wrong, and a lot of activists are pointing to that. As an example here, Canadian government, please don't make the same mistake. But we also have an example of what went right. And that was people getting involved politically, people working together with those they can work together with, and not fighting with those that they don't get along with. Because many times it can be hard for organizations and groups to actually get stuff done because they're so busy talking about how they're going to get stuff done. So the best model to take, which is Mark's model, I believe, is to do what you can as an individual, decide what you can afford to do. For many students, you don't want to risk losing whatever career you're heading into, so you might not be able to be vocal about it. But you could call a radio station with a fake name and give them a comment when you're on the air. They're not going to hunt you down for using a fake name. Just be, hey, I'm Joe, and I live in Vancouver, and I think you're right, marijuana should be legal. Or, you know, just you can choose a method that keeps you safe. And mothers with children, very hard to be an activist, to be vocal and put your name on a letter in the paper. But you can do things like talk with your girlfriends over lunch, or go to the community center with your kids and say to the other mothers, so have you heard about this medical marijuana? Like, what do you think of that? You know, you can do things, you can choose the way that you can get involved with the least amount of risk, because we don't want you taken out of the picture, but with the most amount of impact, because it is up to individuals to make a difference and work with others that they can work with, and to, again, don't bother getting held back by feuds with people that you don't agree with, or that there's someone who doesn't quite follow the same path that you want to. Just ignore them and work with the ones you can work with. And we've seen that in the US, that they are making a difference. They are passing legalization, they are passing decrim, they are passing medical marijuana laws, and that's the example that we can follow. Because, hey man, there are brothers and sisters in arms across the border. The Americans aren't all evil. They need help just as much as we do. So that's where I'm going to wrap it up. One more update, I guess, about Mark is that I just posted his most recent blog at cannabisculture.com. Again, his early release date is July 9th, 2014. He was feeling a bit sick lately, just a bit nauseous, but mostly he's in good health. He gets out in the sunshine a lot and makes me very envious with his tan. He's definitely getting fresh air, and he gets along with everybody. People come up to him, and one guy even said, hey, you're from Canada? And he goes, yeah, because he's the only Canadian there. And he goes, I saw the show on National Geographic, and there was this guy, like he's called the Prince of Pot or something. He's like cleaning a bong, and Mark's like, that might be me. And he goes, oh my God, it is you! Oh my God! So he goes and tells all his Mexican friends, look at this. So like they know who he is. They get along with him. Guards admit that they use it, or that they, watch the union or whatever. So, Mark, even in his position, trying to make the best of where he's at, that's the only way to really live. I mean, I've taken that example from Mark too. If I ever feel down, and it's not often, and sometimes I'm like, oh, are people telling me I should be crying all the time? I definitely miss Mark. It's a huge absence in my life. I don't even want to go into that too much because I think it should be pretty obvious. But if I ever feel down, I just thank the heavens or the cosmos or whatever. I'm just grateful for whatever you have in life that you're grateful for. If you can see you're very fortunate that you can see. You get to see colors, you get to look around. Grateful to be able to breathe without a tube in my throat. I'm grateful I can stand on my own 2 legs. I'm grateful I'm in Canada where I'm a woman with rights. Where, you know, if you really ever feel down, just make a list of how awesome life really is where you are. The fresh air in Vancouver or on the West Coast, you're very lucky. You know, we've got clean drinking water. We've got so much to be grateful for. So no matter what hardships you may come into, you may suffer from, try and find light in the way that Mark has always lived and inspired me and others to live, is that, you know, take gratitude for whatever good is going on in your life, because your life is what you make it. And if you choose to see things all dark and miserable and depressing, it will be dark and miserable and depressing. But if you choose to see light and hope, like I do, I don't believe that with Harper we're going to get legalization in the next few years. I'm sorry, I think we have another decade to go in Canada unless we can get rid of these guys. But I know that there's great value in activists like Ted and Randy and so many others who have laid groundwork, not just for us to keep walking along, but the groundwork is being laid for future generations of activists. And we know that there are many who have come and gone before us, including Michelle Rainey and many others who aren't around today. But they've done something to lay a couple bricks in that road, and whether we see legalization in our lifetime or not, at least we're helping others hopefully get there at some point. So thanks a lot for tuning in.